We said, well, why don't we expand it from 5 to 50? So we went beyond just these metals and we went to energy. We looked at food, we looked at materials, we looked at other metals. So we developed this data set of 50 commodities that are tracked by, the World Bank tracks these prices. So we could go back in time and look at all of their data.
Okay, so I gotta ask you a political question real quick about that. So, I'm obsessed with measurement because I was a psychometrician when I used to be a university professor, when that was still possible. And I've always been skeptical of the measures that politicians use to assess the economy, both unemployment. I'm skeptical of that measure. I'm very skeptical of inflation measures, not in and of themselves, but I'm not convinced that those are sufficiently valid measures, reliable and valid measures to base our entire economic analysis on. And so I'm wondering is if you convert the cost to cost in time and standardize it in that manner, can you then rank order countries? If you take let's say a 50 commodity random sample of fundamental goods, can you then chart a progress graph of countries' relative move towards prosperity? And you do that year by year. Can you derive yearly indexes? And is that a good replacement for something like inflation, the inflation rate assessments?
Take a look at page 142. We've got 42 countries that we've done that with. So we go from Argentina to the United States and look at all of these different countries and measure what their income is doing, their hourly income is doing with these commodity prices. I would go back to
great, man.
Yeah, the World Bank commodity prices. Those are public prices. So there's no disagreement that these were the prices of those commodities. And then the next question is, what do you use for the denominator? Below, you can use a country's local reported average hourly income. In this case, we're trying to get a number that we could use as a proxy for the whole planet. And what we finally came up with is, let's look at GDP per capita per hour. So how much GDP is generated on the planet per hour worked? And let's use that as an index or a proxy for how productive people are getting, because we also note that when innovation occurs, it shows up both in lower prices and higher incomes. So it's important that time prices are actually capturing both of those values, because it's the ratio of those two numbers. So time prices actually contain more information than just a money price.
So this data that you talked about on page 142, you show, for example, that change in resource time price in China, it's negative 97.5%, and China's at the top of the list. And so there's a tremendous number of developing countries that are leaping forward. So, but I would also suspect, maybe this is wrong, but tell me if it's right or wrong. There must be low-hanging fruit to some degree when a country does emerge from its agrarian past, let's say, a non-industrial past, into an industrial present, and free up its markets and move into the modern capitalist age, free market age. And so China, South Korea, Sri Lanka, Ireland does extraordinarily well. Is there any way of adjusting that for baseline prosperity? I mean, the Americans haven't done as well as the Chinese, but they started off a lot better, let's say, in the last century.
Right. And you can make those comparisons. You can put them side by side. I think that the interesting thing for us is, what are the slopes doing in these different countries? I mean, yeah, the United States has got this lower rate of growth, but all of these other countries are catching up at such a rapid rate that there's none of these countries that are actually going the other direction. And
yeah, it's something, eh?
Yeah, it really is. So
Now, the key with China is to remember that China and India, China has done spectacularly well over the last 40 years, and so has India. It's very important to remember that those two countries were actually the most populous countries at the time when they were super, super poor. In other words, if you look at China, if you looked at China in 1960 or India in 1960, they already had mass populations, but they were super poor. So what happens? Superabundance is not simply an outcome of adding more people to the world, although that's important. It's people times freedom will give you very high rates of economic growth. Now, I'm not suggesting for a second that China is a free society, but what I am saying,
well, it's comparatively free compared to what it was.
It is much freer than what it was when Mao killed 45 million of his fellow citizens. Another thing, another reason why this research is kind of important is because Gail mentioned the Club for Growth report. Club for Growth was read by the Chinese Communist Party in the 1970s.
How delightful.
How delightful. Between 1980 and 2015, they had this One China policy in place. The Chinese government is very boastful and very proud that they have prevented or extinguished 400 million births in China between 1980 and 2018. China, as well as world, would be much more prosperous societies if that hadn't happened. But it was a spectacular shot in the foot, as you would expect from a communist regime, because what they are left with now is a very unstable population pyramid, whereby the population is getting old and there are not enough workers to support the economy of the size that they currently have. So they are going to have
they also have a plethora of men, which they're going to pay for too. That's a recipe for social instability.
In like 2016, it was 2008. The sex ratio peaked at 120 Chinese men per 100 women, which means that 20% of men in China could not hope to find a Chinese wife. And there is very good evidence suggesting that men who do not have a partner are much more likely to engage in criminal activities.
Yes, there's very good evidence for that. So one of the really killer things about this graph on page 142 is you have a column there entitled Years to Double Personal Resource Abundance. And so then by your criteria, it's how many years does it take for you to have to work half as long to get the same resource, whatever that is. And this is stunning. This is 1980 to 2018. So basically a 40-year period. Over a 40-year period, China's average years to double personal resource abundance was 7. Unbelievable. But even countries like you list India, it's 15, New Zealand, 19, Finland, 20. So that's really certainly within the confines of, well, that's 4 doublings in the average life, man. It's deadly. And this is even among developed countries. Yeah, it's really